I want to say case closed in terms of what I found today, but it's very, very difficult to make such a bold conclusion after only a few days of thinking and testing. The water is very murky. The effects of yesterday carry over to today. But yesterday I dedicated the whole day to the glute med, attacking the glute med, various different exercises. Predominantly I did the single leg RDLs and the step ups. Completely smoked my glute med. Even last night, as I was kind of sitting there thinking about it, I had a stool in the house and I continued to kind of experiment. It wasn't really a workout, but I continued to kind of test and kind of brainstorm some of my kind of ideas about all of this. Today I came in, it was the opposite, exactly opposite to yesterday. Today was all about hip flexors. A lot of you guys said some really good ideas about how to isolate hip flexors. Hanging single leg raise is one way to remove the glute med out of the picture. Lying down is another thing. What I opted today was basically just lie on my bench. I could have put some mats down, whatever, but lie on my bench and just hook the dumbbell, the kettlebell on my foot, and I just did a basically straight leg raise. That does all of the hip flexors, including the rectus femoris, when the leg is straight like that. So no glute med involvement at all. I'm not standing on it. On the supporting leg, I'm not doing anything. And so started off with squatting, got to around, I think it was like 3 plates. And then I started doing some hip flexors, and I was really, really focusing on how my body felt when I introduced that. Felt good. Felt really, really good, to the point where 140 kind of felt weird because I got sore glutes from yesterday, and it's probably going to get worse tomorrow. I also have, even on the first day, I have sore hamstrings. Now, the hamstrings yesterday when I was doing the single leg RDLs didn't feel like they were getting worked. I felt all of the blood, all of the pump in the glute med. But this morning I woke up and I was like, damn, my hamstrings are sore as hell. On top of that, my calves are also very sore from 2 days before. So yesterday, no soreness. So 48 hours after is where most of the DOMs kind of settle in, except the hamstrings. The hamstrings freaking started hurting last night towards the end of the day. So the hamstrings are so freaking sensitive to this type of eccentric loading that you kind of do in an RDL. So I'm sore today. Bottom line is I'm sore, but I continue to kind of try and test some of these ideas. Yesterday was glute med, today was all about hip flexors. The squats felt good. The 140 felt sluggish. When I started doing hip flexor work, the leg raises, it started feeling better and better. I started feeling more and more solid in my hips. This relationship between everything that I'm talking about, I wasn't sure whether there was a tennis match being played, like a tug of war being played between the glute med and the glute max. Because the glute max to me is quite strong, I would say, after all the deadlifting numbers and all the squatting numbers that I've kind of gotten to. So I was thinking to myself, is this a tug of war between the glute med and the glute max? Glute max being kind of the sole responsible driver for external hip rotation. Glute med being, let's say, the main driver for hip internal rotation. I thought to myself, maybe there's a relationship of that. When external rotation is strong, too much stronger than internal rotation, you have pain, you have TFL is kind of jumping in to save the day because the glute med is really weak. But when you look at the two teams that are involved in external hip rotation and internal hip rotation, you see that this is a not very fair match at all. On the external side, the list goes on to like a million names, it seems. On the internal hip rotation side, the muscles are much, much smaller, and there's only like 3 or 4 of them. Iliacus, hip internal rotation. TFL, you got the med and the min, basically. There's some other smaller muscles involved in hip internal rotation as well, like kind of synergistic muscles. But for external rotation, you got all these big muscles. The glute max, it's like one of the biggest muscles in the body. That's a massive hip internal external rotator. Then you got the piriformis and so on and so on. There's lots of muscles kind of involved in that. Much bigger and stronger and whatnot. So I thought to myself, okay, is it a tennis match between glute max, glute med, and the two teams associated with those two muscles? Or is the conversation going to be between hip flexion and hip extension? Once again, hip extension primarily governed by Mr. Glute Max, and hip flexion being governed by a whole bunch of guys, psoas, iliacus, rectus femoris. These are the hip flexors. Once again, the glute max is by far the stronger unit, and his team is a lot stronger than the hip flexors. So hip flexion and hip internal rotation are kind of like the smaller teams, and whereas hip extension and hip external rotation were much stronger in those movements. So I was kind of thinking to myself, are we talking about rotation, or are we talking about flexion extension? Today I was like, okay, I'm going to come in, I'm just going to focus on the other side of this equation and think about this being an extension flexion type of scenario. And to me, it seems the results that I got today, the feedback that I got today from my body, how I was moving today after I was engaging these two teams, was a lot better than yesterday. The rotation aspect, I think, is important, but I don't think it's the primary problem with me. I think the problem with me is extension flexion, not so much internal and external rotation. So a whole bunch of terminology, a whole bunch of kind of ideas are running around in my head right now, but I'm heavily leaning towards this being a flexion problem. The extensors are really strong, and I have proof by that. I have a pretty good deadlift. It's the flexors that are weak, and this is probably the flexors that are causing the hip pain. Now, all of these things are very found close proximity. The TFL, the glute med, the iliacus, the psoas, they're all kind of around the same thing. And then when you throw in this phenomenon of referred pain is a freaking headache, man. It's a freaking headache, and what somebody might experience, somebody else might not experience. I've been a nurse for 12 years, man. Some people rock up and they're having a full myocardial infarction or a heart attack, and the only thing they're exhibiting is a freaking toothache. I've had people having a proper full-on heart attack with no pain at all, and we found it on ECG, right? So some people don't have any pain at all. Now, some of these people are usually, they have neuropathy secondary to type 2 diabetes, type 1 diabetes, vascular paths. Like there's many different things kind of involved in pain receptors not really working, the neurology not working well. But I just wanted to say that because there's a lot of variation amongst the general population. So when somebody says the textbook heart attack symptoms are central chest pain going down the left arm to the neck or straight to the back, those are kind of like your textbook presentation of chest pain. But some people have not textbook presentations, and you can't be like, oh, you don't have those symptoms, therefore I'm going to give you a category 5 on the triage scale, and you can wait 50 million hours in the waiting room. You can't. You need to be open about various different things, and you need to be open about variation of the general population, because most of us fall into that kind of bell curve, but there's the outskirts of either side of that bell curve. So I'm thinking about all of this to myself. I'm thinking about what the problem is. I'm thinking about rotation, flexion, extension. What I felt today was, if I was a younger self, I'd be like writing my book 100 in bold letters. 100% what we need to do here is hip flexion. That's how I feel today. That's what I would have written in the journal. But what I wrote in the journal today wasn't that. It was, I feel most of the effort should be put into the hip flexion part of this equation. But I cannot ignore the effects of yesterday's workout carrying over in today's workout. My glute med is on. I'm feeling it. Pushing my fingers into it. It is sore. So, where does this leave me? The 1-2 day experiment, the trial is basically over. I'm going to commit myself heavily into hip flexion exercises over the coming weeks. And I'm going to commit myself into exercises which are completely removing the enemy out of, or the opponent out of this equation. So I will no longer be doing marching. I will no longer do any sort of single leg exercises because I don't want that to taint my results. If I'm doing an exercise which is doing both glute, med, and hip flexion and hip flexors, I don't know what the hell is going on. I don't know what is producing these results. I need something that's kind of precipitating these solutes, right? I really want to know what the essence is. And so there are a bunch of exercises you can do to get away from everything else and just completely isolate the hip flexors. This is what I'm doing. Now, in the next week or so, if I start seeing decay of these effects, I'm going to start thinking to myself, well, maybe the glute med needs to be in the picture, and then I might end up in the square one where I need both both flexion and hip internal rotation muscles involved. If that's the case, then but I need some sort of scientific method being exhibited here. I can't just willy-nilly go around and kind of drop conclusions, drop freaking, tomahawks on my piece of paper, like, yeah, this is what's going on. It is very, very hard to do a scientific kind of method in a scenario like this, where you're dealing with one subject and the effects from various different ideas, hypotheses are carrying over and over and over again. I would literally need to kind of even if I took a week off, 2 weeks off, and redid the other hypothesis, there's still decay that kind of far-reaching. So it's very, very hard. But you look for patterns, you look for these similarities, common denominators, you look for all these types of things, and you kind of monitor how you feel and how the numbers are going and whatnot. Today I ended up doing 180 for 3 sets of 5. I maybe could have done another set, but I'm very, very tired right now. Yesterday I did a shit ton of step ups. I did a whole lot of RDLs. I'm sore, so the 180 was hard work today. It's hard work. And, with the step ups and whatever, my quads are probably also fatigued as well. So a whole bunch of things going on. But I'm quite confident to say that I'm leaning towards the hip flexors being the key component in all of this. The initial idea was, I had DOMs in the glute medius, secondary to that marching exercise and to all the loading marching exercise that I did with the ankle weights, with the plates on my thighs. I did all of these things, and I was like, what is going on here? Is there some sort of a, murky water thing happening here, where I think this is what's happening, but it's not really happening? And I think after 2 days of testing, once again, I keep saying I think, I'm very confident that it's the flexors and not so much the hip internal rotators. Now, hip internal rotation is a key component to squatting, but it highly depends on how you squat. If you're squatting with a wider stance, I think you need more hip internal rotation. If you squat with more kind of a narrower stance, you need more external rotation. It just makes sense kind of the way it is. The way I kind of squat, it's very externally rotated type of pelvis, type of hip. And so I can also see that when I test for my hip internal rotation, it's very poor, yet I can hit ATG quite comfortably with decent weight, which tells me my hip external rotation is pretty good on the test. It's not 0 degrees like it is with the freaking internal rotation sometimes. So I'm kind of leaning towards external rotation, hip external rotation, and hip flexion being the kind of primary drivers here with external rotation. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. Whole lot of thinking. This is not easy stuff. This is kind of like backyard science. And for those of you guys who are like scientists or science guys, you might pick my methodologies up. You might pick my constants and my variables all over the place. You might say that it's a really poor study, but that's basically the best I can do in the scenario that I find myself in. I want to thank all the Patreons again. No new names again today. I want to thank everybody on the list. Really appreciate you guys. Really appreciate the comments last night. You guys really, really, really made me think last night. Some really cool conversations going on. Some really nice suggestions as well by all of you guys. So really appreciate all of the thoughts. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace out.